Sometimes life takes everything from you, except the will to keep going. Ruth Callahan knows this truth better than most at 47. She's buried every family member she had and watched their mountain homestead slowly die around her. High in the Bitterroot Range, she works alone, fixing fences and chopping wood with hands that shake from exhaustion. When her last brother dies in a logging accident, Ruth faces an impossible choice. She can abandon the land her grandfather built, or she can do something that would shock the whole valley. She rides down the mountain to find Eli Mercer, a widowed cowboy in his 60s who tends cattle with no son to carry on his name. Ruth has a proposal that's practical, not romantic. She needs a husband, and he needs strong sons. But will a deal between two lonely people become something neither expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind never stops in the Bitterroot Range. It cuts through the pine stands like a blade, carrying the scent of snow even in summer, and the promise of hardship in every gust. Ruth Callahan has learned to read that wind the way other women read Facesh. He knows when it brings rain, when it warns of early frost, and when it simply blows to remind her that the mountains don't care whether she lives or dies. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 months, Ruth stands on the sagging porch of the homestead her grandfather carved from wilderness in 1887. The stone foundation he laid by hand still holds strong, but everything built upon it tells a different story. The roof sags where winter snow has pressed too hard for too many years. The barn door hangs crooked on hinges that should have been replaced a decade ago. Even the fence posts lean at angles that speak of defeat. She wraps her grandfather's old wool coat tighter around her shoulders and surveys what remains of the Callahan legacy. 40 acres of mountain meadow, half of it too steep for anything but goats. A creek that runs clear and cold, fed by snowmelt that never quite stops. Timber that could be worth something if she had the men and equipment to harvest it properly. And everywhere, the weight of memories that press down harder than any snow. Ruth picks up the hand-forged axe that has never left the porch since her grandfather's time. The handle, worn smooth by 4 generations of Callahan hands, fits her grip like it was made for her alone. Which, in a way, it was. She's the last one left to hold it. The woodpile needs attention before the first snow, still weeks away, but already whispering its threats in the morning air. Ruth sets her stance and swings the axe with the practiced rhythm of someone who learned to split wood before she learned to read. The blade bites clean through the pine log, sending both halves spinning into the dirt. Another swing, another split. The physical work quiets the endless calculations running through her mind. How many cords she'll need to heat the house through winter, how many dollars she doesn't have for supplies, how many days she can keep going alone. The sound of her axe echoes off the mountain walls, the only human noise for miles. Once, this clearing rang with voices, her father shouting instructions to his 3 sons, her mother calling them in for supper, the laughter of boys who thought they'd inherited a kingdom instead of a burden, her brothers' voices as they grew into men, arguing good-naturedly about who would take over when their father's back finally gave out. Now there's only the axe and the wind and Ruth's labored breathing in the thin mountain air. She pauses, leaning on the axe handle, and lets herself remember the last time all 4 Callahan siblings stood together in this clearing. It was Tom's 40th birthday, just 2 years ago. Her 3 brothers had come up from their jobs in the valley, Tom from the logging camp, Michael from the feed store, and young Danny from the construction crew. They'd brought beer and stories and the easy camaraderie of men who'd grown up sharing everything from chores to dreams. Ruth, Tom had said that night, gesturing toward the mountain peaks that surrounded them like ancient guardians, "You know, we can't keep this place forever." She'd bristled then, as she always did when anyone suggested abandoning the homestead. Grandfather didn't build this to be temporary. Grandfather had 4 sons to help him, Michael had pointed out gently. He was always the diplomatic one, trying to smooth the rough edges of family arguments. And he had a valley full of neighbors who needed what he could provide. Times have changed. The land hasn't changed, Ruth had shot back. The mountains haven't changed. What we can grow here hasn't changed. Danny, barely 30 and still young enough to believe in easy solutions, had raised his bottle in a mock toast. To our stubborn sister, who'll probably die on this mountain before she admits defeat. The words had stung because they held too much truth. Even then, Ruth had known she was fighting a losing battle. The homestead required the strength of many, and she had only her own. But admitting defeat felt like betraying everyone who'd come before her, everyone who'd poured their sweat and dreams into this unforgiving soil. Now Danny's words echo with terrible prophecy. She might well die on this mountain, but not before she's exhausted every option. Ruth hefts the axe again, attacking the woodpile with renewed vigor. Each swing is a punctuation mark in the argument she's been having with herself for months. Split. She could sell to the timber company that's been sniffing around. Split. She could move down to the valley, find work in town, live like a normal person. Split. She could give up and let the mountain reclaim what it had grudgingly allowed her family to borrow for 4 generations. Or Split could do something that would make the whole valley talk for years to come. The sun climbs higher, burning off the morning mist that clings to the lower slopes. Ruth sheds her grandfather's coat and works in her flannel shirt, feeling the familiar pull in her shoulders and back. She's built for this work, broad through the chest, strong in the arms, with hands that can grip an axe handle or birthing rope with equal confidence. Her hair, more grey than brown now, stays pinned back in a practical bun that won't get in her way during physical labor. She's not a beautiful woman in the way valley women are beautiful. Her face is weathered by wind and sun, lined by squinting into bright snow and dark forests. Her hands are calloused and scarred from years of handling tools and livestock. But there's something in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze that speaks to a different kind of attractiveness, the beauty of competence, of someone who can be counted on when things get difficult. As the woodpile grows, Ruth's mind wanders down the mountain to the valley spread below. She can't see it from here, hidden as it is behind the lower ridges, but she knows its rhythms as well as her own. The ranchers will be moving cattle to higher pastures, taking advantage of the last good grazing before winter. The hay crews will be racing to get second cutting done before the weather turns. And in the heart of it all, Eli Mercer will be working his spread alone, just as she works hers. Ruth has known of Eli Mercer for most of her adult life, the way mountain people know of valley people through grocery store conversations and church social gossip, through the network of information that flows between communities that depend on each other despite their differences. She knows he lost his wife 5 years ago to cancer. She knows he runs a good operation, keeps his fences tight and his cattle healthy. She knows he's somewhere around 60, though he carries his years well, and that he's never remarried, despite the valley widows who've made their interest known. What she doesn't know, but strongly suspects, is that Eli Mercer is as lonely as she is. The axe blade sticks in a particularly stubborn piece of pine, and Ruth has to work it free with both hands. The moment of struggle gives her pause, and she finds herself really looking at the tool in her hands for the first time in years. The steel head, hand-forged by her grandfather's own father, bears the small imperfections that mark it as the work of human hands rather than machines. The edge, maintained through generations of careful sharpening, still bites true despite its age. The handle, replaced twice in Ruth's lifetime, is made from mountain ash that grew on this very property. This axe has built everything she can see, the house, the barn, the fences, the life her family carved from wilderness. It has never failed her, never let her down, never abandoned her to face hardship alone, unlike everyone else. The thought comes unbidden and bitter, and Ruth immediately feels guilty for it. Her brothers hadn't abandoned her by choice. Death had taken them one by one, her parents in a car accident 10 years ago, Michael to a heart attack 3 years back, and now Tom to a logging accident that could have happened to anyone who made his living with dangerous equipment in dangerous places. Danny, the baby of the family at 32, had died last winter when his truck hit black ice on the mountain road. None of them had chosen to leave her, but they had all chosen to leave the mountain for easier lives in the valley, treating the homestead as a weekend retreat rather than a way of life. Only Ruth had stayed, had committed herself fully to the vision their grandfather had pursued with such determination. And now she was reaping the harvest of that commitment, solitude, exhaustion, and the daily knowledge that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. Ruth sets the axe aside and walks to the edge of the clearing, where the ground drops away sharply toward the valley floor. From here, on a clear day, she can make out the geometric patterns of cultivated fields, the straight lines of fence posts, the orderly rectangles of barn roofs. It looks peaceful from this distance, manageable in a way her wild mountain holding never could be. Somewhere down there, Eli Mercer is going about his daily routine, checking cattle, mending fence, doing the 1,000 small tasks that keep a ranch running smoothly. Working alone, just as she is, but on land that doesn't fight him at every turn. Ruth pulls her grandfather's axe from where she'd planted it in the chopping block and tests the edge with her thumb. Still sharp, still ready for whatever work needs doing, just like she is. The decision crystallizes in her mind with the sudden clarity of winter air. She's going to ride down to the valley tomorrow. She's going to find Eli Mercer. And she's going to make him an offer that's purely practical, completely sensible, and utterly shocking in its directness. She needs a husband. He needs strong sons. Everything else is just conversation. Ruth Callahan hefts her grandfather's axe one more time, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. Tomorrow, she'll put it to a use none of her ancestors could have imagined. Not to split wood or clear brush, but to cut through the conventional wisdom that says a woman in her position has no options left. The wind gusts through the clearing, rattling the loose barn door and stirring the sawdust at her feet. But for the first time in months, Ruth doesn't hear it as a threat. She hears it as the sound of change coming, whether the mountains are ready for it or not. The call comes at dawn, as bad news often does. Ruth is already dressed and working on her second cup of coffee when the phone's harsh ring cuts through the morning quiet. She knows before she answers that this call will change everything. Good news waits for decent hours. Ruth, the voice belongs to Frank Morrison, foreman at the logging operation where Tom worked. Ruth can hear it in Frank's voice, the careful way he shapes her name, the pause that follows it like a held breath. How bad? She asks, because there's no point in pretending this is a social call. I'm sorry, Ruth, real sorry. Tom's gone. The words hit her like the recoil of a rifle, expected but still shocking in their finality. Ruth sets her coffee cup down carefully, watching the dark liquid slosh against the white ceramic. Such a small, ordinary action in a moment that's anything but ordinary. What happened? Frank's voice carries the weight of a man who's delivered this news too many times. Tree fell wrong, took out the power line and snapped back. Tom was trying to clear the crew when he stops, then starts again. It was quick, Ruth. He wouldn't have suffered. Ruth closes her eyes and sees Tom as he was last Christmas, laughing at something Danny had said, his face red from the cold and the whiskey they'd shared by the fire. Strong hands gesturing as he told stories about the logging crew, the dangerous equipment, the close calls that were part of his daily routine. He'd always made light of the risks, treating them like inconveniences rather than threats. Where is he now, she asks. County morgue. I'll help with the arrangements, whatever you need. Tom was good people, Ruth. Best man I ever had working for me. After she hangs up, Ruth sits in the kitchen silence and takes inventory of what she has left. No brothers, no parents, no cousins close enough to matter. Just herself and a mountain that suddenly feels larger and lonelier than ever before. The funeral is held 3 days later in the Valley Church, where the Callahans have marked their major life events for 4 generations. Ruth wears her mother's black dress, taken in at the waist, because mountain living has kept her leaner than her mother ever was. She sits in the front pew and watches a handful of people file in Tom's crew from the logging operation, a few neighbors who remember when the Callahan boys were young, the pastor who baptized all 4 siblings decades ago. The service is brief and respectful. Tom wasn't a church-going man in his adult years, but Pastor Williams finds kind words to say about his work ethic and his loyalty to family. Ruth listens with half her attention, the other half occupied with practical calculations. Funeral expenses, legal fees, the accelerating timeline of decisions she can no longer postpone. After the burial, Frank Morrison approaches her at the graveside. He's a weathered man in his 60s, built like a tree stump, and just as solid. His work clothes are clean, but show the permanent stains that mark a man who makes his living with his hands. "Ruth, there's something you need to know." Frank shifts his weight, uncomfortable with what he has to say. Tom had some debts, gambling debts mostly. Nothing terrible, but enough that his creditors are asking questions about his assets. Ruth's stomach tightens. What kind of assets? Well, that's the thing. Tom listed the mountain property as collateral for a loan about 6 months ago. Nothing big, maybe $3,000, but he what? The words come out sharper than Ruth intended. Several mourners turn to look, and she lowers her voice. "Tom didn't own any part of the homestead. It's been in my name since Daddy died." Frank pulls a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "I thought you should see this before the lawyers do." Ruth unfolds the document with hands that tremble slightly. The legal language is dense and confusing, but the core message is clear enough. Tom had somehow used the mountain property to secure a loan he couldn't repay. Whether through forgery, fraud, or some legal loophole she doesn't understand, her brother had put her inheritance at risk for gambling money. "Can they take it?" she asks. Frank shrugs helplessly. "I don't know much about legal matters, Ruth, but I'd talk to a lawyer real quick if I were you." That evening, Ruth sits at her kitchen table with Tom's blood-stained work gloves laid out before her. She'd found them in his truck, forgotten in the chaos after the accident. The leather is soft and flexible from years of use, shaped by her brother's hands into a perfect fit that will never be needed again. The gloves are all she has left of Tom now, that and the legal mess he's created with his desperate borrowing. Ruth touches one of the dark stains on the leather, wondering if it's from the accident or just accumulated grime from honest work. It doesn't matter. What matters is that these gloves represent the final loss, the last weight that tips her situation from difficult to impossible. She's contacted a lawyer in town, a young man fresh from law school, who charges reasonable rates because he needs the experience. He's promised to look into Tom's debt situation, but his preliminary assessment isn't encouraging. At best, she'll face months of legal wrangling. At worst, she could lose the homestead entirely. Ruth picks up one of the gloves and holds it to her face, breathing in the scent of leather and honest sweat. Tom hadn't meant to hurt Hirsch, knows that much. Her brother had been a good man, caught in a bad situation, probably trying to solve his problems without involving family. The gambling had started after his divorce, a way to fill empty evenings that had gradually become something more destructive. But intentions don't matter now. What matters is that Ruth Callahan has run out of time and options. She can fight the legal battle and probably lose everything anyway, or she can take action that might save the life she's built on this mountain. She sets the glove down and walks to the window that faces the valley. Night has fallen, but she can see scattered lights twinkling in the darkness below. Ranch houses where families are settling in for the evening. Barns where men are doing final checks on livestock. A world of ordinary people living ordinary lives, connected to each other by bonds of marriage and kinship and mutual dependence. Ruth has never been part of that world. She's always been the mountain woman, the spinster sister who chose solitude over companionship, independence over security. The choice had seemed noble once, even romantic in its way. Now it feels like a luxury she can no longer afford. Tomorrow, she'll ride down to the valley. She'll find Eli Mercer and make her proposal, not because she wants a husband, but because she needs one. Not because she's looking for love, but because she's looking for survival. Ruth returns to the table and carefully folds Tom's work gloves. They'll go in the trunk with her father's tools and her mother's China family artifacts that tell the story of people who worked hard and loved deeply and still lost everything in the end. Unless she can find a way to change the ending. The wind picks up outside, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter is coming whether she's ready or not. But for the first time since Tom's death, Ruth doesn't feel helpless in the face of forces beyond her control. She has a plan now, desperate and unconventional as it might be. She needs a husband. Eli Mercer needs strong sons. Everything else is just details they'll have to work out along the way. Ruth turns off the kitchen light and heads upstairs to pack. Tomorrow, she rides down to the valley to propose a marriage that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. It's not the life she'd planned, but it's the life circumstances have offered her. And Ruth Callahan has never been one to refuse a challenge, no matter how impossible it might seem. The ride down from the mountain takes Ruth 2 hours on horseback, following the old mining trail that switchbacks through pine forest and rocky outcroppings. Her horse, a sturdy mare named Dolly, picks her way carefully along the narrow path, as familiar with this route as Ruth herself. They've made this journey countless times over the years for supplies, for church, for the social obligations that bind mountain and valley communities together despite their differences. But this trip feels different. Every step down the mountainside carries Ruth further from the life she's known and closer to a future she can barely imagine. She's wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton that her mother made years ago, and her father's old leather jacket for warmth. Her hair is braided and pinned up in a style that's practical rather than fashionable. She looks like what she eyes a mountain woman dressed for business, not courtship. The valley spreads below her as she rounds the final bend, a patchwork of green fields and brown pastures divided by fence lines and irrigation ditches. Cattle dot the landscape like dark punctuation marks, and she can make out the geometric shapes of barns and houses scattered across the floor of the basin. It's a gentler world than her mountain home, more forgiving but also more tame. Eli Mercer's ranch sits on the eastern edge of the valley, where the flat grazing land begins to slope upward toward the foothills. Ruth can see it from the trailer-neat collection of buildings arranged around a central yard, with white painted fences that catch the morning sunlight. Corrals hold a small herd of horses, and cattle graze in pastures that look green and well-maintained, even from this distance. As she guides Dolly down the final stretch of trail, Ruth rehearses what she's going to say. The words need to be direct but not crude, practical but not cold. She's going to shock Eli Mercer no matter how she phrases her proposal, but she'd prefer to shock him into consideration rather than outright rejection. The ranch yard is quiet when she rides in, though she can hear the lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the barn. A few chickens scratch in the dirt near the house, and a border collie emerges from the shade of the porch to eye her with professional interest. The dog doesn't bark just, watches with the calm assessment of an animal that knows its job and does it well. Ruth dismounts and ties Dolly to the hitching post near the house. The mare nickers softly and begins nosing at the sparse grass, content to wait while her rider conducts whatever business brought them down from the mountain. The house is a simple 2-story structure, built for function rather than beauty, but maintained with obvious care. The porch is swept clean, the windows are washed, and the small garden beside the front steps shows the attention of someone who takes pride in his surroundings. It's the home of a man who lives alone but hasn't given up on keeping up appearances. Ruth climbs the porch steps and knocks on the front door. Her heart pounds against her ribs, but she keeps her face composed. This is a business meeting, nothing more. She's here to make a practical proposal to solve mutual problems. The door opens, and she finds herself face to face with Eli Mercer for the first time in years. He's taller than she remembered, lean in the way of men who work cattle for a living. His hair is grey now, silver-white at the temples, and his face shows the weathering of 6 decades spent mostly outdoors. But his eyes are clear and intelligent, and when he recognizes her, they show genuine surprise. "Ruth Callahan," he says, and his voice carries the slight rasp of a man who doesn't talk much during his daily routine. "I heard about Tom. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Ruth straightens her shoulders and meets his gaze directly. "I came to talk with you about something, if you have a few minutes." Eli glances past her to where Dolly stands, tied to his hitching post, then back to her face. Whatever he sees there convinces him that this isn't a social call. "Of course. Come in." The interior of the house is as neat as the exterior, furnished with the simple, sturdy pieces that bachelor farmers favor. A stone fireplace dominates one wall of the living room, and through an archway Ruth can see a kitchen that's clean but sparse. It's the home of a man who takes care of his necessities but doesn't indulge in luxuries. Eli gestures toward a chair by the fireplace, but Ruth remains standing. What she has to say is better delivered on her feet. "Mr. Mercer," she begins, then stops and corrects herself. "Eli, we've known each other long enough for first names." He nods, waiting. There's something about his stillness that suggests patient seno, the tense quiet of a man eager to get back to work, but the deeper calm of someone who's learned to let situations unfold in their own time. Ruth takes a breath and delivers the words she's been practicing all morning. "I need a husband, and you need strong sons. I think we should discuss the practical advantages of a marriage between us." The silence that follows stretches long enough for Ruth to hear the kitchen clock ticking in the next room. Eli's expression doesn't change dramatically. His eyebrows rise slightly, and she sees him blink once, slowly. But otherwise he might as well be considering a comment about the weather. Finally he speaks. "That's direct. I don't see the point in dancing around the subject. We're both adults facing practical problems that could be solved through cooperation." Eli moves to the fireplace and rests one hand on the mantel. Ruth notices that his fingers are long and calloused, the hands of a man who's spent his life working with rope and leather and tools. On the mantel beside his hand sits a small wooden box, polished smooth with age and handling. "What practical problems would those be?" he asks. Ruth had prepared for this question. "I'm about to lose my family's homestead to my brother's creditors. I need someone with the legal standing and financial resources to help me fight that battle. You're running a good operation here, but you're doing it alone, and you're not getting any younger. You need help, and you need someone to carry on your work when you can't. And sons? We're both still young enough for that possibility. But even if we can't have children of our own, there are plenty of orphaned boys who need families. Boys who could learn your trade and carry on your name." Eli turns to face her fully, and Ruth sees something in his expression that might be respect. "You've thought this through." "I've had to. Circumstances don't allow for the luxury of romance or courtship. I'm offering a partnership based on mutual benefit and practical necessity." "What about love?" The question comes quietly, without judgment, but with genuine curiosity. Ruth considers her answer carefully. "I think love is something that can grow between people who respect each other and work toward common goals. I'm not asking you to pretend feelings you don't have. I'm asking you to consider whether we might build something worthwhile together." Eli is quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the wooden box on the mantel. When he looks back at Ruth, his expression is kind but firm. "I appreciate your directness, and I understand the situation you're facing, but I can't give you an answer today. This is, well, it's not something I ever expected to consider." Ruth nods. She'd prepared for this response too. "I understand, but I hope you'll think about it seriously. I'm not asking for promises of happiness or grand gestures. I'm asking for a practical partnership that could benefit us both. And if I say no," Ruth meets his eyes steadily, "then I'll find another way to save my family's land, but I think we could be good partners, Eli. I think we could build something that would honor both our families' legacies." She turns to leave, then pauses at the door. "I'll come back in 3 days for your answer. That should give you time to consider all the angles." Outside, as she unties Dolly and prepares for the ride back up the mountain, Ruth allows herself a moment of doubt. Eli Mercer had listened to her proposal with respect and consideration, but she'd seen something in his eyes when he looked at that wooden box of pain that went deeper than loneliness, a connection to the past that might be stronger than any practical argument she could make. But she'd made her case as clearly as she could. Now all she could do was wait and hope that necessity would prove stronger than memory. Eli Mercer doesn't sleep well that night. Ruth Callahan's proposal echoes in his mind, blunt and practical and completely unexpected. He finds himself pacing the house in his stocking feet, moving from room to room like a man looking for something he can't name. In the kitchen, he makes coffee he doesn't want and stares out at the moonlit pastures where his cattle rest in peaceful clusters. The sight usually brings him comfort, evidence of a life built through careful work and patient attention to detail. Tonight, it only emphasizes how quiet the house feels around him. He returns to the living room and the wooden box on the mantel. His fingers trace its smooth surface, feeling the grain of the wood his own hands shaped 25 years ago. Inside, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, lies Sarah's wedding ring. He hasn't opened the box in months, but he doesn't need to see the ring to remember everything it represents. Sarah had been his wife for 15 years before the cancer took her. 15 years of shared morning coffee and evening conversations, of planning for a future that included children and grandchildren, and growing old together on this land. She'd been gentle where Ruth Callahan was forceful, soft-spoken where Ruth was direct, content with the quiet rhythms of ranch life where Ruth seemed to vibrate with restless energy. But Sarah was gone, and had been for 5 long years. And in all that time, Eli had never seriously considered the possibility of marrying again. The next morning brings the weekly visit from Doc Peterson, who stops by to check on the cattle and share valley gossip over coffee. Doc is one of the few people Eli sees regularly, a man in his 70s who's been tending animals and their owners in this valley for most of his adult life. Heard Ruth Callahan came calling yesterday, Doc says, settling his considerable bulk into Eli's kitchen chair. Whole valley's buzzing about it. Eli raises an eyebrow. News travels fast. Fast as lightning when it involves the mountain woman riding down to visit a bachelor rancher. Doc accepts the coffee Eli offers and takes a thoughtful sip. Course, most folks don't know about her brother's debts. That gambling problem of his was supposed to be private. You know about that. I know Tom Callahan put that mountain property up as collateral for money he couldn't afford to lose. I know Ruth's looking at losing everything her family built unless she can find a way to fight those creditors. Doc studies Eli over the rim of his coffee cup. I also know you've been rattling around this place like a lost soul for 5 years, and that's not good for a man your age. Eli turns to look out the kitchen window at the barn, where he'll spend most of his day checking equipment and tending to the endless small repairs that keep a ranch running. The work is satisfying but solitary, and lately he's begun to notice how the silence presses against him during the long evening hours. She wants to marry for practical reasons, Eli says. Nothing romantic about it. Sometimes practical reasons make the strongest marriages, Doc replies. Romance fades, but respect and shared purpose, those things can last a lifetime. That afternoon, Eli finds himself thinking about Sarah in ways he hasn't for years. Not the idealized memory of perfection that grief sometimes creates, but the real woman she'd been, complete with frustrations and disappointments and unfulfilled dreams. The truth he's never spoken aloud is that Sarah had wanted children desperately, and their inability to conceive had cast a shadow over their marriage that neither of them knew how to address. They'd talked about adoption, but Sarah had always wanted to try for one more year, one more treatment, one more possibility. And then the cancer had appeared, and suddenly all their time was consumed with fighting a battle they couldn't win. Eli walks to the barn where he keeps his tools and equipment, and in the back corner, covered by a dusty tarp, sits the cradle he built during their 3rd year of marriage. He'd worked on it evenings through one long winter, crafting it from cherry wood and finishing it with the kind of care reserved for something precious. The cradle had waited in this corner for 12 years, gathering dust and representing all the children who never came. Ruth Callahan had mentioned sons boys who could learn the trade and carry on the name. Not necessarily their biological children, but children nonetheless. Boys who needed families, who could benefit from the structure and purpose that ranch life provided. The idea stirs something in Eli that he'd thought long buried. He spends the rest of the day working with unusual distraction, his mind turning over Ruth's proposal from every angle. She was right about the practical advantages. He did need help with the ranch, and he wasn't getting any younger. At 62, he could still handle the physical demands of cattle ranching, but he'd begun to notice the small signs of aging, the stiffness in his joints on cold mornings, the way heavy lifting left him more tired than it used to. More than that, he'd begun to wonder what would happen to this place when he was gone. He'd built something good here, something that could provide security and purpose for a family. But without heirs, it would just be sold off, probably broken up and developed. All his work would disappear as if it had never mattered. That evening, as he sits on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Eli allows himself to imagine what life might be like with Ruth Callahan as his wife. She was obviously competent. No one could maintain a mountain homestead alone without being capable and resourceful. She was direct in her communication, which appealed to him more than the elaborate courtship rituals he'd heard about from other men his age. And there was something in her eyes that spoke to a deeper loneliness, a recognition of what it meant to face life's challenges without companionship or support. The photograph he keeps on his bedside table shows Sarah in her wedding dress, young and radiant and full of hopes for their future together. He's kept it there all these years as a reminder of love lost. But tonight he sees it differently. Sarah had been gone for 5 years. She wouldn't have wanted him to spend the rest of his life alone, tied to memories instead of building new possibilities. Ruth Callahan wasn't asking him to forget Sarah or pretend she'd never existed. She was asking him to consider a future based on practical partnership rather than romantic love. And maybe, Eli thinks as he watches the first stars appear above the valley, that kind of foundation might prove stronger than he'd initially imagined. 2 days remain before Ruth returns for his answer. Eli Mercer finds himself hoping that will be enough time to reconcile his heart with a decision his mind has already begun to make. Ruth returns to the valley exactly 3 days later, as promised. This time, she rides Dolly at a steadier pace, her mind focused not on rehearsing arguments, but on preparing for whatever answer Eli Mercer has decided to give her. She spent the intervening days working on her homestead with the kind of fierce energy that comes from knowing time is running out. The lawyer in town had confirmed her worst fears. Tom's gambling debts were legitimate, and the paperwork he'd signed was binding. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the creditors could force a sale of the mountain property. 6 weeks to find a solution or lose everything 4 generations of Callahans had built. Eli is waiting for her on his front porch when she rides into the yard. He's dressed in clean work clothes and has obviously been watching for her approach. The sight of him sitting calmly in his chair, hands folded in his lap, tells Ruth nothing about his decision. His face carries the same patient expression she remembered from their first meeting. She dismounts and ties Dolly to the hitching post, taking her time to gather her composure. Whatever his answer, she's determined to receive it with dignity. "Ruth," Eli says, rising from his chair as she approaches the porch. "Eli." She climbs the steps and stops a comfortable distance away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain the formality their situation requires. "I've given your proposal serious consideration," he begins, and Ruth braces herself for rejection. But his next words surprise her. "I think we should discuss terms." Ruth feels her shoulders relax slightly. Not acceptance, but not refusal either. "What kind of terms?" "Practical ones. If we're going to enter into this arrangement, we both need to understand what we're agreeing to." Eli gestures toward the chairs on his porch. "Would you like to sit?" They settle into chairs that face the valley, and Ruth waits for Eli to continue. The morning sun is warm on her face, and she can hear cattle lowing in the distance and the rhythmic sound of a windmill turning in the breeze. "First," Eli says, We should be clear about the legal arrangements. Your mountain property and my ranch would need to be protected through proper documentation. I don't want you to think I'm trying to take advantage of your situation. Ruth nods. I appreciate that. What do you have in mind? We could structure it so that both properties remain in trust, with both our names on the deeds. That way, neither of us could sell or mortgage without the other's consent. It would protect your land from your brother's creditors and ensure that my ranch stays intact, regardless of what happens between us personally. The practicality of his approach impresses Ruth. He's clearly thought through the legal complexities with the same careful attention he probably gives to breeding cattle or planning crop rotations. What about the day-to-day arrangements? She asks. Eli is quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I think we should start with separate bedrooms. Give ourselves time to adjust to sharing a household before we consider other aspects of marriage. He glances at her, and Ruth sees a faint flush of color in his weathered cheeks. I want you to feel comfortable here. Ruth appreciates his delicacy, though she suspects they'll both need to address the physical aspects of marriage eventually if they hope to have children. For now, however, his suggestion seems wise. That sounds reasonable, she agrees. What about household responsibilities? I'm used to taking care of myself, and I imagine you are too. I'd suggest we split things according to our strengths and preferences rather than following traditional expectations. Eli pauses. Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a cook. Ruth almost smiles at this admission. I can handle cooking if you don't mind plain food. Mountain living doesn't encourage fancy meals. Plain food sounds perfect. They spend the next hour discussing practical details, work schedules, financial arrangements, decision-making processes for ranch operations. Ruth finds herself impressed by Eli's methodical approach to problem-solving. He asks thoughtful questions about her experience with livestock and her knowledge of valley farming practices. She, in turn, learns about his methods for managing cattle, his relationships with neighboring ranchers, and his plans for expanding the operation. It's during this conversation that Ruth begins to understand why Eli Mercer has built such a successful ranch. He thinks systematically, plans ahead, and considers multiple angles before making decisions. These are qualities that would serve any partnership well, romantic or otherwise. There's one more thing we should discuss, Eli says as their practical negotiations wind down. Children. Ruth had been waiting for this topic. You want sons to carry on your work. I want children, yes, but I think we should be realistic about the possibilities. Eli looks out across his pastures, where cattle graze peacefully in the morning sunshine. I'm 62, Ruth. You're 47. We might not be able to have biological children. But we could adopt, Ruth says. There are always boys who need families, especially in the mining camps and logging towns, boys whose parents have died or can't care for them. Eli nods slowly. I've thought about that. There's an orphanage in Helena that places children with ranch families. They look for people who can provide stability and teach useful skills. Ruth studies his profile, noting the way his expression softens when he talks about children. This matters to you. Having sons. It does. Eli turns to meet her gaze. I want to leave something behind besides just property. I want to pass on what I know about this life, about working the land and caring for animals. I want to know that the work I've done will continue after I'm gone. Ruth understands this desire perfectly. It's the same impulse that's driven her to fight so hard to keep her family's homestead, the need to honor the past while building toward the future. If we do this, she says carefully, if we enter into this marriage, I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to make it work. I'm not looking for an easy arrangement or a temporary solution. I'm talking about a real partnership, built to last. Eli considers this for a long moment. When he speaks, his voice carries a weight of decision that tells Ruth he's made up his mind. I think we should try it, Ruth. I think we should get married. Ruth feels a flutter of something that might be relief or anticipation or simple fear. Are you sure? As sure as anyone can be about something like this. Eli stands and extends his hand to her. Partners? Ruth takes his hand and shakes it firmly. His grip is strong and calloused. the handshake of a man who seals his agreements with action rather than words. "Partners," she agrees. As she rides back up the mountain that afternoon, Ruth carries with her a marriage certificate appointment for the following week, and the strange sensation of having committed herself to a future she can't quite imagine. But for the first time since Tom's death, she feels something other than desperation driving her forward. She feels hope. The courthouse wedding takes place on a Thursday morning in early October, with Doc Peterson and the county clerk's wife serving as witnesses. Ruth wears her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her broader frame, and Eli has put on his best suit, the same one he wore to Sarah's funeral 5 years ago. The ceremony itself lasts less than 10 minutes. Judge Morrison, a practical man who's officiated at dozens of Valley weddings, keeps the proceedings brief and businesslike. Ruth appreciates this approach. She and Eli exchange simple gold bands purchased the day before from the jewelry store in town, and when the judge pronounces them husband and wife, they shake hands rather than kiss. "Congratulations," Doc Peterson says afterward, pumping Eli's hand enthusiastically. "You've got yourself a fine woman there, Eli. Ruth, you've got yourself a good man." Ruth manages a smile, though the whole experience feels surreal. This morning she was Ruth Callahan, spinster mountain woman. Now she's Ruth Mercer, married to a man she barely knows, committed to a life she can't yet envision. The ride to Eli's ranch now, she supposed passes in comfortable silence. Ruth's few possessions are loaded in the back of Eli's truck. 2 suitcases of clothes, a wooden chest containing her mother's china and her father's tools, and her grandfather's hand-forged axe wrapped carefully in an old quilt. Everything else she's left on the mountain, either sold to raise money for legal fees or simply abandoned as too cumbersome to move. The hardest item to leave behind was her mother's piano, which had somehow survived 40 years of mountain winters in the homestead's front room. But there was no practical way to transport it down the narrow trail, and no place for it in Eli's efficiently organized home. The first week of cohabitation proves more awkward than either of them anticipated. Ruth moves into the spare bedroom upstairs, a simply furnished room that obviously hasn't been used for anything but storage in recent years. She arranges her few belongings carefully, trying to make the space feel like home, while being mindful that she's a guest in someone else's house. Eli, for his part, struggles with sharing his daily routines. He's been a bachelor for 5 years, accustomed to eating when he's hungry, sleeping when he's tired, and organizing his time around the needs of cattle and crops rather than human companionship. Having another person in the house, especially a woman, requires adjustments he hadn't fully considered. Their first real conflict arises over breakfast preparation. Ruth, accustomed to hearty mountain meals designed to fuel hard physical labor, prepares eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fried potatoes. Eli, who's been living on coffee and toast for years, stares at the loaded plate she sets before him with something approaching alarm. "This is a lot of food," he says carefully. "You're a working man," Ruth replies. "You need proper nutrition. I usually just have coffee in the mornings. Save the big meal for evening." Ruth pauses in her own eating, recognizing the first test of their partnership. "What time do you normally eat your main meal?" "Around 6, after the evening chores are done." She nods thoughtfully. That makes sense. More efficient than stopping work in the middle of the day. She looks down at the elaborate breakfast she's prepared. "I suppose I got carried away." "Mountain habits." Eli seems relieved by her reasonable response. "Maybe we could start with something simpler, work our way up to the full meal once we've figured out our routine. It's a small negotiation, but it establishes a pattern for how they'll handle other adjustments. Neither of them insists on having things their own way. Instead, they look for solutions that accommodate both their preferences and the practical demands of ranch life. The more significant challenge comes when they begin working together on ranch operations. Ruth has extensive experience with livestock, but mountain cattle are different from valley herds. Her methods, learned through necessity and isolation, sometimes clash with Eli's more systematic approach. The conflict comes to a head during their first attempt to move cattle from the home pasture to winter grazing land. Ruth, accustomed to working alone with minimal equipment, tries to direct the herd using voice commands and aggressive positioning. Eli, who relies on careful planning and coordinated movement, watches her scatter the cattle in 3 different directions before finally stepping in. "Ruth," he says, and his voice carries a note of frustration she hasn't heard before. "You're pushing too hard. These cattle aren't used to that kind of pressure." Ruth stops in the middle of trying to turn a particularly stubborn steer and looks at the chaos she's created. Cattle mill around the pasture in confusion, and what should have been a simple hour's work has turned into an extended battle of wills. "How do you do it?" she asks, swallowing her pride. Eli demonstrates his method: patient, methodical, using the natural tendencies of the herd rather than fighting against them. Ruth watches and learns, gradually understanding that valley ranching requires a different kind of skill than mountain survival. By the end of the day, they've successfully moved the cattle, but both of them are exhausted and frustrated. Over dinner, they address the underlying issue directly. "I'm not trying to criticize your methods," Eli says, "but I've been working these particular cattle for years. They respond to consistent handling." Ruth nods, poking at her stew with more attention than it deserves. "I'm used to doing things my own way. It's hard to change habits that have kept me alive for 20 years. "I don't want you to change who you are," Eli replies. "But maybe we could find ways to combine what we both know, your experience with difficult conditions and my knowledge of these specific animals." It's during this conversation that Ruth discovers something unexpected about her new husband. In the barn later that evening, while they're doing the final check on the cattle, she notices Eli examining something in the far corner. When she approaches, she sees him pulling a dusty tarp away from a beautifully crafted wooden cradle. The cradle is made from cherry wood, sanded smooth and finished with obvious care. Every joint is perfect, every curve graceful. It's the work of someone who built it not just with skill, but with love. "You made this," Ruth says. "It's not a question." Eli runs his hand along the cradle's edge, his touch gentle. "Years ago, for Sarah and me, we never had children." Ruth sees pain in his face, but also something else, hope, perhaps, or the possibility of hope. "It's beautiful work," she says softly. "I thought maybe if we're able to take in boys someday, or if we—" He doesn't finish the sentence, but Ruth understands. She reaches out and touches the cradle's smooth surface. "It would be a shame to let something this fine gather dust forever." Eli meets her eyes, and for the first time since their wedding, Ruth sees him not as a business partner or a practical solution to her problems, but as a man who has his own dreams and losses and hopes for the future. "Maybe it won't have to," he says quietly. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the spare room, Ruth thinks about the cradle and what it represents. She and Eli are still strangers in many ways, still learning each other's habits and preferences. But they're also partners now, bound together by more than just legal documents and practical necessity. They're bound by the possibility of creating something neither of them could achieve alone. 3 weeks into their marriage, Ruth discovers the legal documents while organizing Eli's filing cabinet. She's looking for cattle vaccination records when her fingers brush against a manila envelope filed under property documents. The envelope is old, yellowed at the edges, and bears her grandfather's name in faded ink. Ruth pulls the envelope free with hands that suddenly feel unsteady. Inside, she finds a promissory note dated 22 years ago, signed by Thomas Mercer, Eli's father, and witnessed by Samuel Callahan, her grandfather. The amount is substantial for that time period. $5,000, secured by a mortgage on the Mercer Ranch property. The document is accompanied by a letter in her grandfather's careful handwriting, explaining the circumstances of the loan. A severe drought had threatened to bankrupt the Mercer operation. Thomas Mercer had come to Samuel Callahan, hat in hand, asking for help to save his family's ranch. Samuel had agreed, taking the ranch as collateral but with the understanding that the debt would be forgiven if circumstances improved. But circumstances hadn't improved quickly enough. Thomas Mercer had died of a heart attack 2 years after signing the loan documents, leaving young Eli to manage both the ranch and the debt. The payments had continued sporadically for several years, but eventually stopped altogether. According to the paperwork, the final payment was made 15 years ago, leaving a substantial balance still owed. Ruth sinks into Eli's desk chair, staring at the documents that reframe everything she thought she knew about her situation. If these papers are legally binding and they appear to Besh doesn't just own her mountain homestead. She owns a significant portion of Eli's ranch as well. The kitchen door slams, announcing Eli's return from the evening chores. Ruth quickly stuffs the documents back into their envelope, her mind racing. Does he know about this? Has he known all along that she had a legal claim to his property? Is that why he agreed to marry her not out of practical partnership, but out of fear that she'd discover the truth and take legal action? Ruth? Eli's voice carries from the kitchen. Everything all right? Fine, she calls back, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. Just finishing up some paperwork. But nothing is fine. Ruth feels as if the ground has shifted beneath her feet, calling into question every assumption she's made about their marriage. She'd approached Eli as a desperate woman with nothing to offer but hard work and the possibility of children. Now she discovers that she came to the negotiation holding the stronger hand without even knowing it. That evening over dinner, Ruth studies Eli's face for signs of deception. But he seems the same as always, calm, methodical, asking about her day and sharing details about a sick calf he's been treating. If he's harboring a guilty secret, he hides it well. Ruth waits until they're sitting on the front porch after dinner, watching the sun set behind the mountains, before she confronts him with her discovery. I found some interesting documents in your filing cabinet today, she says, pulling the envelope from her jacket pocket. Eli glances at the envelope, and Ruth sees something flicker in his expression. Not guilt, exactly, but recognition, and perhaps resignation. Ah, he says quietly. I wondered when you'd come across those. You knew I'd find them eventually. I hoped you would. I've been trying to figure out how to bring it up. Eli leans forward in his chair, clasping his hands between his knees. It's complicated, Ruth. It seems straightforward to me. Your father borrowed money from my grandfather and never paid it back. According to these documents, I have a legal claim to half your ranch. Eli nods slowly. That's probably true, though I'd want a lawyer to review the paperwork to be certain. Ruth had expected denial, or anger, or at least some attempt at justification. Eli's calm acceptance throws her off balance. Did you know about this when I proposed to you? She asks. I knew about the debt, yes. My father told me about it before he died. Eli's voice carries the weight of old shame. He made me promise to pay it back when I was able. But there were so many bad years after he passed: drought, cattle disease, market crashes. Every time I thought I might be able to make payments, something else would happen. So you just ignored it. I tried to contact your grandfather several times over the years, to work out a payment plan or at least acknowledge the debt, but he never responded to my letters. Eli looks at her directly. I think he was too proud to accept money from people he'd tried to help. Ruth considers this, remembering her grandfather's stubborn independence and his reluctance to discuss family finances with his grandchildren. That still doesn't answer my question, she says. Did you marry me because you were afraid I'd discover this and take legal action? Eli is quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening valley. When he speaks, his voice is thoughtful rather than defensive. When you first came to me with your proposal, I'll admit the irony wasn't lost on me. Samuel Callahan's granddaughter, asking me for help to save her land, when my family owed hers a debt we'd never been able to repay. He pauses. But no, Ruth. I didn't marry you out of fear or guilt. I married you because I thought we could build something good together. Even knowing that I could have taken half your ranch without marrying you at all. Could you have? Eli asks. Really? You're a practical woman, Ruth. Would you have wanted to own half a ranch you didn't know how to run with a partner who resented your claim to it? Would that have been better than what we're trying to build here? Ruth hadn't considered this angle. She'd been so focused on the revelation of her legal rights that she hadn't thought through the practical implications of exercising them. Besides, Eli continues, there's something else you should know. He stands and walks to the porch railing, leaning against it as he chooses his words. After Sarah died, I updated my will. If something happens to me, everything goes to charity. The ranch, the cattle, all of it. I had no family to leave it to, and I didn't want some distant relative to inherit land they'd never worked. What does that have to do with anything? It means that even if you'd successfully claimed half the ranch through your grandfather's loan, you'd only have been able to keep it as long as I was alive to run it. When I died, your half would have been worthless without someone who knew how to manage the operation. Ruth stares at him, beginning to understand the complexity of their situation. You're saying we needed each other more than either of us realized. I'm saying that maybe this marriage was less about practical necessity and more about fate than we wanted to admit. Eli returns to his chair and looks at her seriously. The question is, how do you feel about that? Ruth examines her emotions, trying to separate anger from surprise, from the strange sense of inevitability that's settling over her. She'd thought she was taking control of her situation by proposing this marriage. Now she discovers that forces beyond her understanding had been shaping events long before she made her desperate ride down the mountain. I feel manipulated, she says honestly, by circumstances, by family history, by things I didn't know and couldn't control. Eli nods. I understand that. The question is, what do we do about it now? Ruth looks at the legal documents in her lap, then at the man who's become her husband through a combination of practical necessity and hidden family connections. She could be angry about the secrets, could feel betrayed by the complexity of their situation, but another part of her recognizes something almost miraculous in how events have unfolded. I think, she says slowly, that we tear up these old papers and start fresh. Whatever debts our families owed each other, whatever claims we might have had, none of that matters now. We're partners, Eli. Equal partners building something new. Eli's expression softens with what might be relief. Are you sure? Ruth stands and walks to the porch railing, looking out at the land they now share completely, no longer divided by old debts or legal complications, but united under their joint ownership and care. I came down from the mountain looking for a husband who could help me save my family's legacy, she says. I found a partner who shares that same goal, and whose family history is more connected to mine than either of us knew. Maybe that's not coincidence. Maybe that's just life finding a way to heal old wounds. She returns to her chair and deliberately tears the promissory note in half, then in half again. We'll make our own agreements from now on. No secrets, no hidden debts, no claims based on the past. Just two people working toward a future neither of us could achieve alone. Eli watches the pieces of paper flutter to the porch floor, carrying with them the weight of 20 years of family obligation and guilt. Partners, he says, extending his hand to her, just as he had the day she first proposed. Partners, Ruth agrees, taking his hand with a grip that feels stronger and more certain than it had 3 weeks ago. For the first time since their wedding day, it feels like they're truly choosing each other. The letter arrives on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by Mrs. Henderson from the County Social Services office. Ruth is in the kitchen preparing lunch when she sees the official car pull into their yard, and something in the formal way Mrs. Henderson approaches the house tells her this isn't a social visit. Eli comes in from the barn as Ruth opens the door, and they both listen as Mrs. Henderson explains the situation with the kind of careful professionalism that barely conceals her underlying distress. We have 2 boys, she says, settling her considerable frame into one of their kitchen chairs. Brothers, aged 8 and 10. Their parents died in a house fire 3 weeks ago, and their only living relative, a grandmother in Colorado, can't take them due to her own health problems. Ruth and Eli exchange glances. They've been married for 6 weeks now, and their partnership has settled into comfortable routines. But they've only begun to discuss the possibility of children in abstract terms, as something that might happen in the future, when they felt more established as a couple. "What kind of boys are they?" Eli asks, and Ruth appreciates that his first question focuses on character rather than convenience. Mrs. Henderson pulls a folder from her briefcase and opens it carefully. Tommy and Jake Morrison. Good boys, according to their teachers, though they're struggling with the trauma of losing their parents. Tommy, the older one, has been acting out, getting into fights at school, refusing to follow instructions. Jake, the younger boy, has gone in the opposite direction. He barely speaks, won't eat much, seems to have withdrawn into himself. Ruth studies the photographs Mrs. Henderson shows them. Two boys with sandy hair and serious eyes, standing close together in what must have been a school picture taken before their world fell apart. They look like brothers, not just in their physical resemblance, but in the way they stand shoulder to shoulder, as if they've learned to depend on each other against the world. "Why are you bringing them to us?" Ruth asks. "Surely there are other families." "There are," Mrs. Henderson admits, "but most families want younger children, or they want children without complications. These boys have been through terrible trauma. They need a stable home with people who understand that healing takes time." She looks around the kitchen, taking in the neat arrangement of furniture, the evidence of two people learning to share space and responsibilities. "Your names came up because several people in the valley recommended you. Doc Peterson spoke very highly of both of you, and Pastor Williams mentioned that you'd expressed interest in taking in children who needed homes." Ruth doesn't remember having that conversation with Pastor Williams, but she supposes it might have come up during one of their brief encounters at the post office or general store. Small communities have long memories for casual comments that reveal deeper intentions. "What would be involved?" Eli asks. "Legally, I mean." Mrs. Henderson launches into an explanation of the foster care process, the eventual possibility of adoption, the financial support the county provides, and the regular visits and evaluations that would be required. Ruth finds herself only half listening to the procedural details, her attention caught by the photographs of the two boys who have lost everything and need a place to belong. "They're not easy children right now," Mrs. Henderson continues. "The trauma has affected them both, just in different ways. Tommy is angry and defensive. He's been in 3 different foster homes in the past month, and none of them worked out. Jake follows Tommy's lead, but he's also dealing with nightmares and anxiety that make him difficult to comfort." "Where are they now?" Ruth asks. "Temporary placement with a family in Helena, but that situation can't continue indefinitely." Mrs. Henderson closes the folder and looks at them directly. "I'm not going to lie to you. Taking these boys would be challenging. They need consistency, patience, and people who won't give up on them when things get difficult." Ruth looks at Eli, trying to read his expression. They've talked about children in theoretical terms, but this is suddenly very real and immediate. 2 traumatized boys who need more than just a place to live. They need healing and hope, and the kind of family stability that can only come from adults who are committed to the long-term work of raising children. "Could we meet them?" Eli asks, "before making a decision?" Mrs. Henderson nods. "I'd prefer that, actually. It's important that everyone involved feels comfortable with the arrangement." They schedule the meeting for the following Saturday. Mrs. Henderson will bring the boys to the ranch for the afternoon, giving everyone a chance to see how they interact in a less formal setting than her office would provide. After Mrs. Henderson leaves, Ruth and Eli sit at their kitchen table in silence, both of them processing what they've just committed to, considering. "Are we ready for this?" Ruth asks finally. Eli runs his hand through his graying hair, a gesture she's learned means he's thinking through all the angles of a complex situation. "I don't know if anyone's ever really ready for children," he says, "but we've got a stable home, steady income, and we both know how to work hard. That's more than a lot of families can offer." Ruth considers this. It's not just about providing for them. They need emotional support, help dealing with their grief. "I don't know anything about helping children through trauma." "Neither do I," Eli admits. "But we can learn. And we can give them something that might be just as important, a place where they belong, where they're not just temporary guests waiting for someone to decide their future." That evening, They walk through the house with new eyes, imagining how it might work as a home for 4 people instead of 2. The spare bedroom where Ruth had initially slept could be converted back to its intended use. The small room off the kitchen that Eli uses for storing ranch supplies could be cleaned out and turned into a second bedroom. But the physical arrangements are the easy part. Ruth finds herself lying awake that night, thinking about the photographs of the 2 boys, and wondering whether she and Eli have the emotional resources to help children heal from such devastating loss. She's never been a mother, never even been around children much during her years of mountain solitude. Her experience with nurturing is limited to orphaned calves and injured wildlife creatures whose needs are simpler and whose healing follows more predictable patterns than human hearts. The next few days pass in a flurry of preparation. Ruth and Eli clean and organize the potential bedrooms, stock the pantry with foods that might appeal to children, and have long conversations about discipline, expectations, and how to handle the inevitable challenges that will arise. Eli surprises Ruth by revealing how much thought he's already given to the subject of raising children. His marriage to Sarah had included years of hoping and planning for parenthood, and while those plans had never materialized, they'd left him with clear ideas about the kind of father he wanted to be. "Sarah and I used to talk about having a big family," he tells Ruth as they paint the spare bedroom in a color more suitable for children than the institutional beige it had worn since his bachelor days. 3 or 4 kids, maybe more. She wanted them to grow up knowing how to work with their hands, how to take care of animals, how to find satisfaction in simple things. Ruth watches him roll paint onto the wall with careful, even strokes. "Do you think she would approve of what we're doing?" Eli pauses in his painting, considering the question seriously. "I think Sarah would be happy that this house might finally have the children's voices she always wanted to hear in it. She wasn't possessive about things like that. She wanted good things to happen, even if she couldn't be part of them." On Friday evening, the day before the boys are scheduled to visit, Ruth makes a discovery that changes her understanding of what they're about to undertake. She's in the barn, looking for additional furniture that might be useful in setting up the children's rooms, when she notices a cloth sack tucked behind some old harness equipment. Inside the sack, she finds children's clothes-to sets of everything, sized for boys approximately 8 and 10 years old. The clothes are clean but well worn, the kind of practical garments that farm families buy for active children. At the bottom of the sack, wrapped in tissue paper, are 2 small wooden toys, a carved horse and a tiny replica of a ranch gate that opens and closes on hinges. When Eli comes in from his evening chores, Ruth shows him what she's found. "I bought those things last month," he says, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment. "After Mrs. Henderson first mentioned the possibility of placing children with us. I thought they might need clothes that fit properly and something to play with." Ruth examines the wooden toys, noting the careful craftsmanship that marks them as Eli's handiwork. The horse is perfectly proportioned, its mane carved with individual strands. The gate is a miniature replica of the ones that control access to their pastures, complete with a working latch mechanism. "You made these," she says. "I had some time in the evenings. Seemed like something that might help them feel welcome." Ruth looks at her husband, really looks at him, and sees something she'd missed before. Beneath his practical exterior and methodical approach to problem-solving lies a capacity for hope and tenderness that has been waiting years for an outlet. "We're going to do this, aren't we?" she says. "We're going to take these boys and try to give them a family." Eli nods, reaching out to touch the carved horse with one finger. "I think we have to try. I think this is why everything happened the way it did. Why you came down from the mountain, why we found each other, why we discovered we're stronger together than either of us could be alone." Ruth carefully rewraps the toys and returns them to the cloth sack. Tomorrow, 2 traumatized boys will visit their ranch and help determine the shape of all their futures. Tonight, she and Eli will finish their preparations and hope that love and determination will prove sufficient for the challenges ahead. As they walk back to the house together, Ruth realizes that somewhere in the past 6 weeks, her practical marriage arrangement has become something deeper and more complex. She's not just partnered with Eli Mercer to save her family's legacy or secure her financial future. She's partnered with him to create new life, new hope, new possibilities that neither of them could achieve alone. The boys' visit tomorrow will test whether that partnership is strong enough to support not just their own dreams, but the healing that two wounded children desperately need. The boys arrive on Saturday afternoon in Mrs. Henderson's county vehicle, two small figures pressed against the back window, like prisoners being transported to an uncertain fate. Ruth watches from the kitchen window as the car pulls into their yard, her stomach tight with nervousness she hasn't felt since the day she first rode down to propose to Eli. Tommy Morrison emerges from the car first, a wiry 10-year-old with defiant eyes and a chin set at an angle that speaks of too much experience with disappointment. He surveys the ranch with the calculating gaze of someone who's learned not to invest hope in new places. His younger brother Jake follows more hesitantly, staying close to Tommy's side like a shadow afraid of being separated from its source. Ruth and Eli walk out to meet them, and Ruth is struck by how small the boys look standing in their yard. The photographs hadn't conveyed their fragility the way Jake's clothes hang loose on his thin frame, or how Tommy's defensive posture can't quite hide his underlying fear. "Boys," Mrs. Henderson says with professional cheerfulness, "I'd like you to meet Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. They're the people I told you about who might be able to give you a home." Tommy looks up at Eli with eyes that are too old for his face. "You got any other kids?" "No," Eli replies honestly. "It would just be the four of us." "What about animals?" Jake speaks for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruth kneels down to Jake's eye level. "We have cattle and horses and some chickens. Do you like animals?" Jake nods solemnly but doesn't elaborate. Tommy steps slightly in front of his brother, a protective gesture that tells Ruth these boys have learned to depend on each other for survival. "Want to see the place?" Eli asks, and something in his tone, patient, unthreatening, causes Tommy's defensive posture to relax fractionally. They begin with the barn, where Eli introduces the boys to the horses. Jake's face lights up when a gentle mare named Rosie nickers softly and extends her nose toward his outstretched hand. It's the first genuine expression Ruth has seen from the younger boy, and it gives her hope. Tommy remains skeptical, but she catches him watching Eli carefully as her husband explains how to approach the horses safely, how to read their body language, how to earn their trust through consistent, gentle behavior. "My dad used to say animals know when you're scared," Tommy says suddenly, then looks surprised that he's spoken. "Your dad was right," Eli agrees. "Animals are honest. They respond to what you're really feeling, not what you pretend to feel." It's a simple observation, but Ruth sees it land with both boys in different ways. Jake seems to find comfort in the idea that the animals will understand his fear. Tommy appears to appreciate the concept of honesty, perhaps tired of the careful politeness that has characterized his interactions with social workers and potential foster families. They move on to the cattle, where Ruth demonstrates how to check water troughs and inspect fencing. She's surprised when Tommy asks practical questions about the work, how many cattle they run, how much hay the herd needs through winter, whether they raise their own feed crops. "You thinking about becoming a rancher?" Ruth asks. Tommy shrugs, but his interest is obvious. "Maybe. Beats being stuck in school all day." Mrs. Henderson clears her throat meaningfully, but Ruth understands what Tommy is really saying. He's looking for work that feels purposeful, adult responsibilities that matter, a place where his contributions would be valued rather than merely tolerated. The tour concludes at the house, where Ruth shows them the bedrooms she and Eli have prepared. The boys examine the spaces with the careful attention of people who've learned not to assume permanence, but she sees Jake run his hand along the freshly painted wall with something that might be longing. Over lunch, the conversation remains cautious but gradually becomes more natural. Tommy reveals a sharp intelligence beneath his defensive exterior, asking pointed questions about ranch finances and the practical aspects of taking in foster children. Jake says little, but cleans his platee, the first solid meal he's apparently eaten in weeks, according to Mrs. Henderson. After lunch, while Mrs. Henderson reviews paperwork with Ruth and Eli in the kitchen, the boys explore the yard on their own. Ruth watches through the window as Tommy shows Jake how to climb the fence rail safely, then helps his younger brother down when Jake gets scared. The protective dynamic between them is clear, but she also sees genuine affection in Tommy's patience with his brother's fears. "They're good boys," Mrs. Henderson says, following Ruth's gaze. "Traumatized, certainly, but fundamentally sound. Tommy's anger is really just fear, and Jake's withdrawal is a normal response to losing everything familiar. With time and consistency, they could heal." "What happens if we say yes?" Eli asks. "There would be a trial period," Mrs. Henderson explains. 6 months of supervised placement, with regular visits from social services. If everything goes well, you could begin adoption proceedings. Ruth looks out at the boys, who are now examining the chicken coop with the kind of focused attention that suggests genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "And if we say no, they'll go back to Helena, and we'll keep looking for a permanent placement. But I'll be honest, good homes for older children, especially sibling pairs, are hard to find. These boys might end up in separate placements if we can't find a family willing to take them both." The thought of the brothers being separated hits Ruth harder than she expected. She's been an only child herself, but she's watched her brothers rely on each other through various childhood crises. Tommy and Jake have already lost their parents. Losing each other might be more trauma than they could survive. Ruth catches Eli's eye and sees her own thoughts reflected in his expression. They're both thinking about the wooden toys he carved, the careful preparations they've made, the conversations about legacy and purpose that have shaped their marriage from the beginning. More than that, they're thinking about 2 boys who need what they have to offer, not just a home, but a chance to belong somewhere, to contribute to something larger than themselves, to heal in a place where their value isn't questioned. Outside, Tommy has lifted Jake up to see inside the chicken coop, and Jake is laughing at something one of the hens has done. It's the first time Ruth has heard either boy laugh, and the sound carries through the kitchen window like a promise of possibility. 6 months later, spring has transformed the valley into a patchwork of green pastures and blooming wildflowers. Ruth stands at the kitchen window, watching Tommy teach Jake how to properly halter one of the young horses. The boys have grown in the months since they arrived, not just physically, though Jake has finally put on the weight he'd lost after his parents' death, but in confidence and the easy familiarity that comes from belonging somewhere. The transformation hasn't been without its challenges. Tommy's anger had erupted repeatedly during their first month together, testing every boundary Ruth and Eli established. There had been broken dishes, slammed doors, and tearful midnight conversations when nightmares drove Jake to seek comfort from the adults who were slowly becoming his parents. But there had also been breakthroughs. The morning Tommy had asked Eli to teach him how to rope cattle. The evening Jake had crawled into Ruth's lap during a thunderstorm and fallen asleep there, finally trusting enough to show vulnerability. The day both boys had called them Mom and Dad, without prompting or self-consciousness. Today marks a special milestone. The boys had been working on a secret project for weeks, disappearing into the barn workshop whenever their chores were finished. Ruth had respected their privacy, though she'd been curious about the sounds of sawing and hammering that emanated from behind the closed workshop door. This morning, they'd shyly asked Ruth and Eli to come outside after breakfast for a surprise. Now they stand beside the barn. Jake bouncing with barely contained excitement, while Tommy maintains the dignified composure he considers appropriate for a boy of nearly 11. "We made something for you and Dad," Jake announces, then immediately covers his mouth as if the words had escaped without permission. Tommy takes over the explanation with more measured delivery. "We wanted to show you that this is our home now, all of ours." He leads them around the corner of the barn, where a wooden sign hangs from a newly installed post. The sign reads, "Mercer Callahan Ranch," in carefully carved letters, painted white against a dark blue background. Below the words, Smaller text identifies the property as home of the Mercer family, Ruth, Eli, Tommy, Jake. Ruth feels tears prick her eyes as she examines the craftsmanship. The lettering is uneven in places. Clearly, the work of young hands still learning to use woodworking tools, but every letter has been formed with obvious care and attention. "We asked Mr. Peterson how to spell everything right," Jake explains eagerly, "and Dad helped us with the hard cuts, but we did all the painting ourselves." "Tommy designed the whole thing," Ruth says, recognizing her older son's methodical approach to problem-solving in the sign's balanced layout. "Jake picked the colors," Tommy admits. "I wanted to make it all white, but he said it needed to be more." He searches for the right word. "More happy," Jake supplies helpfully. Eli runs his hand along the sign's smooth edge, testing the joints and examining the mounting brackets with the critical eye of someone who knows good craftsmanship when he sees it. "This is professional work," he says seriously. "You boys did something to be proud of here." Ruth studies the sign more carefully, noting details that speak to hours of careful planning and execution. The wood has been sanded smooth and sealed against weather. The mounting post is set deep and level. Even the paint job, while clearly amateur, has been applied with multiple careful coats. But more than the craftsmanship, she's moved by what the sign represents. By including both her maiden name and Eli's family name, the boys have acknowledged the blending of histories that created their unconventional family. More importantly, by listing all four names as the Mercer family, they've declared their own sense of belonging in a way that no legal document could match. "When did you have time to work on this?" Eli asks, genuinely curious about the logistics of keeping such a project secret. "Mornings mostly," Tommy explains, "while you and Mum were doing the bookkeeping. And Jake kept watch to make sure you didn't come to the barn early." Ruth laughs, remembering several occasions when Jake had intercepted her on her way to fetch tools from the barn, suddenly developing urgent questions about homework or requests for help with small tasks that kept her in the house. "You were both in on this conspiracy," she says, ruffling Jake's hair affectionately. "It wasn't a conspiracy," Jake protests, though he's grinning. "It was a surprise. There's a difference." The sign dedication becomes an impromptu celebration. Ruth retrieves her camera from the house and takes pictures of the boys standing proudly beside their creation. Eli produces a bottle of sparkling cider he'd been saving for a special occasion, and they toast the official naming of their ranch as a family enterprise. As they stand together in the spring sunshine, Ruth reflects on how much has changed since that desperate morning when she'd ridden down from the mountain with nothing but a practical proposal and the determination to save her family's legacy. She'd found more than a husband and a way to keep her land. She'd found a family that honored both the past she'd fought to preserve and the future she'd never dared to hope for. Tommy and Jake have adapted to ranch life with the resilience of children who've learned that home is something you create rather than something you're given. Tommy's natural leadership abilities have found outlets in helping with cattle management and teaching Jake the skills he's learned. Jake's gentle nature has made him the family's unofficial animal whisperer, capable of calming spooked horses and coaxing sick calves back to health. More than that, they've brought life and laughter to a house that had been quiet for too long. Their voices calling to each other across the yard, their arguments over chores and privileges, their excitement about school projects and ranch achievements, all of it has transformed the Mercer homestead into something Ruth and Eli could never have created alone. "I have something for you boys too," Eli says, disappearing into the barn and returning with a wooden box Ruth recognizes. It's the same box that had held Sarah's wedding ring, the one she'd noticed on the mantel during her first visit to propose marriage. Eli opens the box and reveals two identical pocket knives, their handles carved from the same cherry wood he'd used for the baby cradle years ago. Each knife bears one of the boys' names carved in careful script. "Every rancher needs good tools," Eli explains as he hands each boy his knife. "These belong to my father and grandfather. I've been saving them for sons who would appreciate their value." Tommy examines his knife with the reverence of a boy who understands that he's receiving more than just a tool. he's being entrusted with family heritage and expectations for the future. "Thank you, Dad," he says quietly, and Ruth hears in his voice the recognition that he's truly part of something larger than himself now. Jake clutches his knife against his chest, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. "Can I show it to Rosie?" he asks, referring to the horse that has become his special favorite. "After lunch," Ruth says. "Right now, I think we should celebrate our new family sign with a proper meal." As they walk toward the house together, Ruth and Eli, flanked by two boys, who chatter excitedly about their morning's revelation. Ruth catches sight of their reflection in the kitchen window. They look like what they've become, a family that chose each other rather than being bound by blood, but no less real for that choice. The wooden sign will weather and fade over the years, requiring occasional maintenance and eventual replacement. But what it represents, the deliberate creation of belonging, the conscious decision to build a future together, will endure as long as any of them draw breath. Behind them, the Mercer-Callahan Ranch sign swings gently in the spring breeze, marking the place where two lonely adults and two traumatized children discovered that the strongest families are sometimes the ones forged by choice, necessity, and the patient work of learning to love. 1 year later, Ruth sits on the front porch in the early evening light, watching Eli teach Tommy the finer points of horse training in the corral. Jake is nearby, carefully brushing Rosie's coat with the methodical attention he brings to everything involving animals. The scene has become as familiar as breathing, yet Ruth never tires of witnessing the easy collaboration between her husband and their sons. In her lap lies a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her careful handwriting, documenting their first year as a family. She'd started the journal as a practical record, noting the boys' progress in school, their adaptation to ranch life, the small milestones that marked their healing. But somewhere along the way, it had become something more personal, a love letter to the life they'd built together, written in daily observations and quiet revelations. Ruth opens the journal to the first entry, dated the day after Tommy and Jake had moved in permanently. The boys are settling in better than expected. Tommy helped Eli fix the fence in the north pasture without being asked. Jake ate 3 helpings of breakfast and didn't have nightmares last night. Small victories, but they feel enormous. The entries that follow chart a gradual transformation not just of the boys, but of all of them. Ruth had written about her own learning curve as a mother. The way maternal instincts she'd never known she possessed had emerged in response to scraped knees and homework struggles, and the 100 small crises that define childhood. She documented Eli's evolution from careful bachelor to confident father, watching him discover patience he'd never needed and joy he'd forgotten was possible. The man who had once eaten solitary dinners while reading cattle magazines now animated his evenings with stories about the boys' achievements and plans for their future. Most remarkably, she'd recorded the gradual emergence of Tommy and Jake from their protective shells. Tommy's anger had given way to the natural leadership qualities of a boy who'd learned to channel his intensity into useful work. Jake's silence had blossomed into the cheerful chatter of a child who finally felt safe enough to share his thoughts with the world. "Mom, look!" Jake's voice pulls Ruth from her reading. He's standing beside Rosie, his small hand resting on the mare's neck, his face glowing with pride. "She's letting me touch her face now." Ruth smiles and waves acknowledgement of this achievement. Jake's relationship with the horses has been one of the unexpected joys of their family life. His gentle nature and infinite patience have made him remarkably effective at working with animals that others find difficult to handle. Tommy finishes his lesson with Eli and approaches the porch, his face flushed with exertion and satisfaction. At nearly 12 now, he's shooting up in height and beginning to show the broader shoulders that suggest he'll have his father's build. More importantly, he carries himself with the confidence of a boy who knows his place in the world and takes pride in his responsibilities. "Dad says I can start working with the young cattle next week," he announces, settling onto the porch step beside Ruth's chair, the ones that haven't been handled much yet. "That's important work," Ruth says, recognizing the significance of Eli's trust in Tommy's abilities. Dangerous work, too. You'll need to be careful. Tommy nods seriously. Dad's been teaching me how to read their body language, how to know when they're getting scared or aggressive. He says most accidents happen when people stop paying attention. Ruth watches Eli approach the porch, his movements showing the slight stiffness that comes from a full day of physical labor, but also the satisfaction of work well done. At 63, he remains strong and capable, but she's noticed him beginning to rely more heavily on Tommy's help with the demanding aspects of ranch management. Good lesson today, Eli says, settling into his usual chair beside Ruth's. Tommy's got natural instincts with the horses, better than I did at his age. Better than me now, Ruth adds. And it's true. While she's become competent at most ranch tasks, horse training remains Eli's special tyone that Tommy seems to have inherited, along with his father's patient temperament. Jake joins them on the porch, having finished his grooming duties, and climbs into the chair that's become his regular spot for evening conversations. These twilight discussions have become one of Ruth's favorite parts of their daily routine, time when they share the day's experiences and plan for tomorrow's work. Mrs. Henderson called today. Ruth says, addressing the topic she's been saving for when they were all together. The adoption papers are final. You boys are officially Mercers now, legally and permanently. The announcement is greeted with the kind of calm satisfaction that marks truly significant moments. There are no dramatic celebrations or emotional outbursts, just the quiet recognition that what they've known in their hearts for months has now been acknowledged by the legal system. Does that mean we can't get sent away anymore, Jake asks, and Ruth hears the last echo of the insecurity that once defined him. Never, Eli says firmly. You're our sons now, no matter what happens. That's permanent. Tommy, characteristically, focuses on the practical implications. Do we get new birth certificates? Yes, Ruth replies, with Mercer as your last name and both Dad and me listed as your parents. As the sun sets behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple, Ruth reflects on the journey that brought them to this moment. She'd ridden down from her mountain homestead, a desperate woman with nothing to offer but hard work and determination. She'd found not just a husband and a way to save her family's land, but a love deeper and more complex than anything she'd imagined possible. The practical marriage she'd proposed had become a passionate partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the daily choice to support each other through whatever challenges life presented. More than that, it had become the foundation for a family that honored both the past they'd inherited and the future they were building together. Ruth opens her journal to a fresh page and begins to write. Today the adoption became final. Tommy and Jake are officially our sons, though they've been that in every way that matters since the first week they lived with us. Eli gave them each a silver dollar to commemorate the occasion, the same coins his father gave him when he was legally adopted by his stepfather at age 10. Family traditions continuing into another generation. She pauses in her writing to watch Jake demonstrate for Tommy how Rosie responds to different voice commands. The boys' easy collaboration, their shared delight in small discoveries, their instinctive protection of each other, all of it speaks to bonds that go deeper than legal documents or formal ceremonies. What are you writing about? Eli asks, leaning over to glance at the journal's pages. Us, Ruth replies simply. Our first year as a family, everything we've learned, everything we've built together. Eli smiles, the expression carrying all the contentment of a man who has found his life's purpose. Think we'll have more years worth documenting? Ruth looks around at their assembled family, two boys who've grown from traumatized orphans into confident young men, a husband who's become the kind of father she'd never dared to hope for, a ranch that's become more prosperous and purposeful than either of them could have managed alone. I think, she says, closing the journal and setting it aside for the evening, we're just getting started. The last light fades from the valley as the Mercer family settles into the comfortable quiet of home. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to strengthen the bonds they've chosen to forge. But tonight, they rest in the satisfaction of knowing they've built something rare and precious, a love that began with practical necessity and grew into the kind of legacy that will endure for generations. Above them, the first stars appear in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a family that proves the strongest foundations are sometimes laid not by blood or chance, but by the deliberate choice to build a future together, one day at a time.